Okay, this is similar to what I did with Macbeth, is a 5-minute overview, hopefully 5 minutes of the context linked to A Christmas Carol. And just to remind you, context is really about when and where the novel, in this case, or novella, was written and set. But it can also mean when it was read, i.e. you can consider the readers of the time, which was the mid-19th century, but you can also consider how we read the text today. So is it still relevant in the 21st century, which I think it definitely is. As you can see, I've just outlined some key things that I think are important about the Victorian period in relation to the novel. So we'll work through those, and then I'll, same as I did with Macbeth, link it to some key quotes. But just to reiterate the importance of involving and including context in your AQA Lit Paper 1 exam for both the Macbeth and A Christmas Carol sections. The first thing on the left to talk about is Christianity. Just as was the case with Shakespeare, when Dickens was writing much later, hundreds of years later in the mid-19th century, we are still predominantly a Christian society where people believed in heaven, they believed in the dangers of going to hell and the importance of confessing your sins to God if you wanted to have a better life in the afterlife. So it's at the centre of the novel in many ways. It's about a sinner, Scrooge, who ultimately asks for forgiveness, and the three spirits that visit him obviously can be seen as, messengers from God, giving him a chance to avoid wandering in purgatory, as Jacob Marley does, or inevitably ultimately going to hell. So we're dealing with a readership who would have responded to key Christian ideas about confessing sins, about the fear of hell and the redemption of heaven. On the right hand side, very different to the context of Shakespeare, is the idea that when Dickens was writing and he published this novella, which is a short novel in 1843, that you are in the midst of a massively changing society, a modernising society, because due to the dominance of coal in the British Isles being close to the surface, and a number of technological and mechanical inventions at the time, you suddenly had an industrialised urban society created. So industrialisation during the mid-19th century due to coal created vast wealth for many of the property classes, but the flip side of that was millions of people, many of whom had moved to the cities to find new work in factories, earned very little and were exploited. And I've put 1 in 5 there just on the right hand side of that box about industrialisation, because it's a shocking statistic that in the mid-19th century, when Dickens was writing this novella, 1 in 5 children died by the age of 5 years old. So the rates of child mortality for the working classes predominantly was massively high, and that was partly due to industrialisation, unsanitary conditions, pollution, the spread of disease in poor housing, and a lack of nutrition due to very low wages and overwork. So this is a really, really desperate and difficult time of change in Victorian society. And while some people are getting very, very rich, many millions are dying and living pretty awful and miserable lives. If we go down a bit on the left, you can see I've written prisons and workhouses, which is obviously actually linked to a line in the novel, which we'll talk about in a bit. But it's just an awareness. One way that the Victorians tried to deal with the problems of poverty and unemployment was, so one of the ways governments dealt with the poor was to lock them up in workhouses, which were institutions that were seen as pretty brutal and depressing places for many. Families were split up, men and women were split up, children were split up from their parents, and the food and the work and the conditions were pretty depressing. Many hospitals that exist today, and I know the one I was born in, and there was one in Chelmsford as well, it was recently knocked down, wasn't it, were workhouses. They were big buildings that could house hundreds, sometimes thousands of people, but they felt pretty much like prisons for many. So the idea of locking up the suffering, the poor who moved to the cities to find a better life was, not working for many people in Victorian society. On the right hand side I've put education. You guys take education perhaps for granted. Some of you might not feel always very positive about education, but the fact that you are given state provided schooling and it's compulsory for all and available for all is a legacy of the 19th century. But when Dickens was writing this in 1843, while there was a growing movement for education in the early 19th century, most children had little education and were put to dangerous and poorly paid work. So again, linking to industrialisation, a shocking statistic is that you had children as young as 5 years old chained up and working in coal mines underground for 14-hour days for very little money. So there was a massive irony about the 19th century Victorian Britain, was that we were seen as civilised and we were seen as massively powerful with a growing empire, but yet some of the worst things going on in the world in terms of the treatment of children, in terms of the treatment of the poor, were going on in our own country to our own people. So the irony was slavery was abolished, but not actually for the working class in Britain. If we go down, I've put 3 more boxes there. The one in the centre says family. The importance of family life was very much celebrated by Queen Victoria, who is a massively important figure in this era. Obviously gives the name to the period, the Victorian period. But she fostered and encouraged this view that a good Victorian, a good member of Victorian society, was a person who valued and loved their family. And I think this is something that Dickens, I suppose, taps into in the novel and celebrates. This was quite ironic because although Dickens had a very large family himself with many, many children and presented himself as a happily married man, he was actually having an extramarital affair and his marriage was pretty miserable. So I think he idealises family life through the Cratchits in the novel, and he wants and encourages and perhaps dreams of himself of a perfect family life. On the left, the Victorian period was really seen as an age of reform. So Dickens was along with many middle-class, self-made people, as he was somebody who wanted and argued for social change, as they feared a breakdown in society, really. The French Revolution had happened in the early 19th century, and many Victorians like Dickens felt that if you continued to treat the poor as was going on in industrialised Britain very poorly, no irony intended there, you were going to actually create perhaps a revolution and a breakdown in society completely. So in some ways A Christmas Carol is a warning sign. It's a shot across the bows of the middle classes in Victorian Britain to say, if you don't change, i.e. If Scrooge doesn't change as he represents the middle class, then you will be punished for it at some point, and that might be in the form of a revolution. Lastly, you got there Christmas. We take it for granted, don't we, that Christmas is meant to be a time of sharing, of maybe giving to charity, of the importance of family, and that is a tradition that in some ways Dickens is contributing to creating in the 19th century. This was a fairly new conception of Christmas that maybe we're used to and take for granted today. It became a popular idea during the 19th century, again fostered and encouraged by Queen Victoria. You had the invention of the Christmas card. I think Prince Albert was responsible for introducing the Christmas tree tradition from Germany, Europe to Britain, and the importance of the family Christmas dinner and the giving of gifts. All of this was in some ways developed into the modern idea of what we call Christmas today. So Dickens is celebrating and encouraging this idea that Christmas is a time for giving, for thinking of others, and for being with your family. So you've got to make sure in your exam that you bring in or show your knowledge or understanding of some of these themes. Well, there's just 3 quick quotes here just to give you an example of how you might link them into context. I realise this has gone over 5 minutes, so I apologise. The first one is probably the most mushy and sentimental quote in the novella, "God bless us everyone," which is a quote from Tiny Tim right at the end of Stave 5, I think, at the end of the novel. Obviously, it ties in with that idea that Dickens is writing a religious novella, a religious text, where he wants to remind his readers that if they want to go to heaven and they want to be looked as good citizens of a Christian society, then they will look after people like Tiny Tim. Tiny Tim is, someone who is disabled, who is termed a cripple, and is cured, saved by Scrooge. So Scrooge almost becomes a Christ-like figure in that sense. He manages to heal the sick with the money that he has, which he can use to good, and which he does at the end of the novella, because we're told Tiny Tim is saved. The second quote, "Are there no prisons? Are there no workhouses?" Well, this was a line that I think the Ghost of Christmas Present throws back at Scrooge when he shows him the 2 stray orphans called Ignorance and Want. And it's a reminder that the children who are suffering in the Victorian society are completely blameless and innocent, and yet Victorian society ends up punishing them. And Dickens thought that that was bitterly wrong. So when Scrooge sort of sees prisons and workhouses as the answer to all the problems of the Victorian society, Dickens is showing his anger, really, that that was not working, that was not the case, and that children, 1 in 5, remember, in cities in Victorian England were dead by the age of 5. So this is a really angry piece of dialogue that Dickens uses to show how desperately flawed Scrooge's view of the world is. The last one is quite mushy as well, and lots of people do accuse this novel of being mushy and sentimental, and I think in some places it is. But when Scrooge does change and transform, which is one of the key themes of the novel, transformation, he says, "I will honour Christmas in my heart." And I think, although Dickens suggests he's saving his own bacon in some sense, he doesn't want to go to hell, he doesn't want to be punished and wander around purgatory forever with safes chained to him as Jacob Marley is. He does believe in good, he believes in love, he believes in charity by the end of the novel, or the novella, and that's what makes the novella a really moving piece of literature. But that ties in with the Christian the Christian theme. It ties in with Victorian Christmas as a time of thinking about charity and reform. It ties in with Dickens' ideas of celebrating the family and making people's lives better in Victorian society.